Okay, we're broadcasting now. And to start off with our little review this evening, let me make sure I've got the right PowerPoint control here. There we go. I think this is the one. Go right back to topic one. We're going to try to breeze through this as quickly as possible. A lot of this is, again, common sense. And some of you may, already understand what I have here. Others might need that just a little extra bit to get them a little bit more familiar with the questions that are on the test and things of that sort. And if there isn't something here that you want to get covered, then we can certainly talk about that. Dave sent me an email earlier about the. If I understand it correctly, Dave, you're having a difficult time understanding the bands as it relates to the frequencies and what band they're on. Is that correct?
Yes, off of these charts.
Right.
Okay. It's one thing to refer to me to refer to everything as a frequency, and I can relate to all of that. But in the same sentence, then it'll change and start talking about bands. So instead of saying, okay, the 10-meter band, all of a sudden it'll start talking about, the 2800 kilohertz or something. It's
Okay.
that relationship. Yeah, I know the formula. I can sit and crank through that formula each and every time, but I don't see the easiest way to remember the correlation between the bands and the
In other words,
frequencies.
if I said something like, "Let's tune out. Let's go to the 80-meter band, or I'll meet you on the 80-meter band." You you want to know what the frequency range is on the 80-meter band. Is that correct?
That's correct. Without having to either look it up or, in the case of the test, I'd actually have to hand crank out the through the formula to see what it is.
Okay. Well, there are some things, and it's not really all that important to understand the relationship as far as the exam is concerned. This is the kind of thing that is going to come to you when you get into the hobby, and because it takes a while to really understand and say, okay, the 15-meter band is, oh, what is that? Oh, that's 21 megahertz to 21.450 megahertz. And uh, I you have little aids, operating aids that pretty much you keep at your desk that kind of help you a little bit. Having that chart up, even I have it here. I took a little, oh, what do you call it? A little label maker, and I put a label across the edge of the one of my shelves that kind of gives me particular information that I'm interested in. In other words, I want to know what the bottom end of the extra class voice band is. And so I put that in there, and I already know what the upper end is. So I just want to know what the beginning is so I don't encroach my voice on the CW portion. And those are things, those little operating aids that you're going to probably want to have handy with you as time goes on. Eventually, a lot of this stuff will become just pretty much rote, and it'll be etched in your memory forever and a day. Um, Back when I got started, we didn't have what's called the WARC bands. Um, they added those bands later on. Basically, what we had was 160 meters, 80 meters, 40 meters, 20 meters, 15, and 10, insofar as HF is concerned. And then from there, above 10, of course, we went to 6 meters, 2 meters, and uh, and 70 centimeters and up through there. But they added, of course, some bands: 12-meter band, 17-meter band, 30-meter band, and those don't get used much, at least by me. And I call them the bastard stepchildren of ham radio, really, when it comes right down to it. Um, but every one of the bands has a purpose as it relates to particular band conditions at any particular time of day. The
Mhm.
goal of ham radio, in essence, is that we have the ability to communicate irrespective of the time of day and hopefully over the distances we want to cover. At nighttime, in particular in the wintertime, like right now, a 160-meter band, which is 1.8 megahertz to 2 megahertz, or 1,800 kilohertz to 2,000 kilohertz. That particular band is rather active during the wintertime, especially in the evening. And that it doesn't get much use during the summer. There are some times when it does get use, again, but that band is most usable at night. And it's we refer to the time that a frequency or a particular band of frequencies that's usable is called the MUF, or the maximum usable frequency, for a particular time of day. And of course, 80 and 40 meters, those particular bands as well, they operate best at night as in addition. If you get it into the 20-meter band and higher frequencies, the 20-meter band gives you pretty much consistent and regular communication capability across the big pond that we know as the Atlantic Ocean, and even coast to coast and down south into South America and uh, Central America, Canada, and those places. So 20 meters is a really, really good band, and it seems to be fairly consistent year round. Um, and a lot of my overseas contacts, particularly when I'm mobile, I'm have really very little difficulty talking to stations on 20 meters in the mobile rig, um, to like Spain and Italy and France and those places over there. So 20 meters is a rather robust band during the day, and then towards the evening it kind of fades out. And you'll notice that, um, like the Hurricane WatchNet, for instance, they operate on. They have several frequencies that they operate on. 20 meters is one, and 40 meters is another, and those particular bands. Any rate, to get back to your question here, um, for the purposes of the test, don't fret over it too much. Just answer the question and know that if you remember the number 300, okay, if you want to know what the wavelength of a particular frequency is, you divide 300 by the frequency, and the frequency is always in megahertz. So if you have a reference that says 3,500 kilohertz, you want to convert that to 3.5 megahertz, divide that um, into 300, and you come out somewhere around 75 to 80 meter, or probably closer to 80 meter, gives you the 80-meter band. Conversely, if you want to know what the frequency of the 80-meter band is, you divide 80 into 300 and to get that. And that works for just about, works for all the bands there. And it's just an approximation, basically. It's not an exact science, it's an approximation. Um, and you can always find the closest answer to that where you want to be just by using that formula. The other formula to be mindful of is 468. If you're looking to create a half wave antenna, a half wave dipole antenna, and you want to know what size to make it or how long you want that wire to be for the dipole antenna, you divide the frequency, again in megahertz, into 468. It's another little magic number that we have. And when you divide the frequency into 468, you come up with an approximate length of the antenna. And once you come up with that length, you're going to divide it in half, and that's going to be your feed point for the dipole. One is going to go to the center conductor, the other leg is going to go to the shield of your coax or your feed line. If you're looking to figure out the length of a quarter wave antenna, then the number is 234. So you divide frequency in megahertz into 234, and that gives you the overall length of a quarter wave antenna. Again, you're going to divide that in half, and you're going to connect one leg to the center conductor and the other leg to the shield of your feed line. So those are kind of some of the basic formulas to kind of keep in mind as it relates to the length of antennas in relation to a frequency, and the frequency and the wavelength of antenna. And the wavelength is always in meters. So anyway, we're going to kind of get into that right here. We're going to go right into the next slide. We're going to kind of cover that topic. So I hope that helps a little bit, Dave.
Yes, it did. That's what I was looking for. Is excuse me, a quick and easy reference without running through the divide by 300 each time. But
well, again, your operating aid is going to be your little chart there too.
But you don't have that for the test.
No.
That's what I was trying to get through, is just to make sure I can get through the test.
Yep.
Okay. Thank you.
Yep. All right. First slide that we have tonight. Which of the following is the purpose of the amateur radio service as stated in the FCC rules? It's a fairly simple one. And remember, this is not personal radio communication service for as many people as possible, or even providing communications for that nonprofit. The basic of this is the advancing the skills in the technical and communication phases of the radio art. And kind of hoping that's pretty obvious, but I wanted to actually throw that in there anyhow. So as soon as you pass your examination for your radio license, you can transmit, okay? You can transmit as soon as your operator station license grant appears in the FCC's license database in the ULS, Universal Licensing System. So someone can keep an eye on that for you, or you can keep an eye on it yourself. And then as soon as you find out that your license has been granted, you are legal to operate. The FCC does no longer send a paper license to you. However, you do have the opportunity to go on the FCC website and print a paper version of your license, and you should choose the official copy that you can display at your station, as well as one that's a wallet size. So that's available to you. So how many operator or primary station license grants may be held by any one person? You cannot get 2 licenses. You can only have 1, okay? And each person has to have a license. It doesn't cover your family. It doesn't cover anyone else except you. So everyone has to have a license in order to legally operate in the amateur bands. And if your license has expired, but is still within the allowable grace period, may you continue to operate a transmitter in the amateur radio service? The quick answer to that is A, no, you cannot. Once you're expired, you can no longer transmit. And it's very important that if you move, to keep your address updated in the FCC database so that they can send you information. If you move, and the FCC should send you a notice at your old address and it gets returned back to them, they can very well suspend your license, and you may not know that, and you may be operating, and suddenly, somebody knocks at your door and says, "Hey, I'm from the FCC. You don't have a license to operate, blah, 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 blah." So at any rate, you got to make sure that you keep it up to date, and you keep it obviously renewed so that you can continue your operating uninterrupted. Call signs. Okay. When may an amateur station transmit without on-the-air identification? Okay. This is the tricky one, okay? You really need to identify, but there is one place where or one time that you can transmit without having to identify. And that's if you're using radios to control cars, boats, radio controlled craft of any type. But your transmitter has to be labeled with the call sign that you have, and I believe also your address. So you got to make sure that you have that information on there if you're getting a signal and all of a sudden it doesn't happen that I know of. I've never heard of anybody, getting stopped by the FCC for this. But if you're operating radio control, you don't have to do a voice identification, but just make sure your call sign is on the transmitter. Okay. Yep.
Sorry. Something real quick with that. You also have to have your call sign and license or address on the device that you're operating?
Yeah, I believe so. At least the call sign on it.
Okay.
Yeah, at least the call sign. I don't think that's a question on there, but the purpose of that really is of that question is just to let everybody know that the only time you're allowed to transmit without identifying is if you're using remote control, radio control. So valid call signs take on a particular format. And when you look at this, there's only one correct answer on there. There's only one acceptable call sign. And it's what's called a 1x3 call sign. And there's also 2x3s. So more than likely, you're going to get assigned a 2x3 call sign. And it's probably going to start with K. It's going to be KD or KE or something like that. But A is the only valid call sign here. KA1 is not, W1 is not. As far as technician class amateur radio station is concerned. So in other words, what I'm saying here is that you're going to get assigned a 2x3 category call sign initially. If you want a vanity call, your only choices are from the 1x3 and the 2x3 list of call signs that are currently available. You'd have to have a higher class license in order to get a 2x1 or a 1x2. And usually those are reserved for extra class, advanced and extra class licensees. In other words, I could get a 1x2 or a 2x1, but I'm still with what's called a 1x3 N3 LMS. And the 1x3 and 2x3 indicates that it's 2 letters, then your number, which is the call area that you live in, followed by 3 more letters. The call areas, you won't really have to know too much about that. We live in the 3 call area, as do people in Maryland. You get up to K1, you're like up in Maine and those areas up there. And 2 calls are like New York and New Jersey, things of that sort. 5 call would be down around Texas and areas there. 8 calls are out Ohio, those places. 7 calls are out around the Washington state area. 6 calls are usually in California, things like that. 4 is down south of us here. So there's different call areas. And at one time you were supposed to, if you moved to a different area, you had to reapply for a new call sign if you moved to a call area. They don't do that anymore. But predominantly, this is what a valid call sign is for a tech class amateur license, a 1x3 or a 2x3. So as far as tactical identifiers are concerned, this is a little touchy subject for some people. You still have to use your FCC assigned call sign. And it's not that you can't use tactical identifiers. You're still legally obligated to use your call sign at the end of each communication and every 10 minutes during communication. So that is very important to do. However, the tactical call sign, you can say, this is Checkpoint Charlie N3 LMS, and you've satisfied the requirement. You can still use them. So which of the following formats of a self-assigned indicator is acceptable when identifying using a phone transmission? One of the things about this, if you're traveling to a different call area and The part of the reason for this is if you signed on with like the KL7CC, you're driving mobile down the road, somebody, and you're in the 3 call area, somebody might think that uh, you're actually driving up and around Washington State, Oregon State, and I think, "Ooh, I've got some DX going on here." But if you identify with KL7CC stroke W3, slant W3, or slash W3 that says, "Okay, that person is is visiting from Oregon or Washington, and they're in my 3 call area," but all those choices are correct. Oh, KL7, that's right, it's Alaska. I don't know what I was thinking. KH is Hawaii, by the way. Okay, what is the International Telecommunications Union? Again, this is an organization that pretty much coordinates and organizes the various uh, bands and everything that are used in different countries, and it is a United Nations agency, and so that should be a no-brainer there for you. Okay. A little bit of common sense goes a long way with this. The more you know, the better off you're going to be. However, probably about 80% of the correct answers are going to be the longest one. With which countries are FCC licensed amateur radio stations prohibited from exchanging communications with? Oops, come on now. There we go. It happens to be any country whose administration has notified the International Telecommunications Union that objects to such communications. So if these countries have said, we don't want to communicate with anybody, outside our own country, and currently it's the Democratic People's Republic of North Korea and Eritrea. Still don't know where that place is. So anyway, I've never looked it up.
It's near Egypt.
Oh, is it?
Yeah, it's like along the Red Sea or something.
Is it?
It's over there. It's on the border of like Egypt or one of those areas there.
It must be a small country.
Yeah. It's really, really small. It's let me double check I looked it up just to see what it was, and
yeah, smaller than Luxembourg.
I'm not sure how big Luxembourg is, but it's just a tiny little spot.
I don't even know if they have any ham radio operators in those places.
They communicate strictly 2 meter, no repeaters, cover the whole country.
Really?
Yeah, it's really small. It's like,
wow.
It's along the Red Sea.
Okay. Well, thank you.
You're welcome.
All right. And what types of international communications are permitted to an FCC licensed amateur station? And this again goes along with the other one, communications incidental to the purposes of the amateur radio service and remarks of a personal character. So in other words, you're not going to be talking about, what you do for a living necessarily, or at least anything in depth, as far as, like where you work and, things of that sort. It's just, you're going to be talking about your amateur radio station and maybe, things of personal character, like, I'm married, I have 3 kids, and I like to cook out burgers in my backyard. So, that's about it. Because a lot of times in these other countries, if they monitor anything that might sound like code language to them, they may come down on that ham in that country and be in trouble. So we got to be careful when we're talking to other stations in other countries and what we actually talk about. I know one time when you made contact with Russia, a Russian station, it, it had to be, it was very, very curtailed, and you didn't get into a whole lot of conversation with them. And mostly it was just talking about your radio equipment. I have this radio, I have this antenna, um, and it's pretty much hi bye Charlie. So I don't think it's that way much anymore today. What is meant by the term third party? Do I have the right one up here? I hope this, yeah, okay, I do. What is meant by the term third party communications? All right, that's any type of communication that is done on behalf of another person. Um, and of course, we can only conduct third party communications with other nations that have a third party agreement with the US. So, a message from a control operator to another amateur station control operator on behalf of another person is an example of third party communications. And this can include an unlicensed person talking over an amateur radio station or an amateur passing a radiogram on behalf of a third party. So you're talking to Sergey over in Russia, and his wife is not licensed, but he is. Uh, since I think we do have an agreement, third party agreement with Russia, Sergey's wife could get on, or one of his kids could get on and talk with you, and vice versa. They could talk with Sergey. So, which of the following restrictions would apply to a non-licensed person who is allowed to speak to a foreign station using the station under control of a tech class control operator? The answer to this is very easy. The foreign station must be one with which the U.S. has a third-party agreement. Again, that's your longest answer there. So you have to have a third-party agreement, just to reinforce that. And when are you allowed to operate your amateur station in a foreign country? Um, this one, let's see, only really when the foreign country authorizes it. Okay, and if you if there are reciprocal operating agreements with the U.S., um, you really need to apply for a license to operate in that country. Um, and there's various ways that happens. I was going to get my license for the Bahamas, and I could have done it one of two ways. I could have applied for a license in the Bahamas to operate there using my call sign and a slash uh, designation at the end of it, or I could have been assigned an actual Bahamian um, call sign if I wanted to operate there. And some of the restrictions, however, require you to be an extra class operator. Um, a lot of these countries, they don't have different classes of operator permits. Um, some have an entry level, and some have an advanced level, some have intermediate levels. But predominantly, if you want to operate a station in another country and you want to get a reciprocal operating permit, you have to do it. You would almost have to have an extra class US license in order for a reciprocal agreement to be granted. I checked on that. My wife, being a tech class, she would not have been allowed to have a license in the Bahamas, nor to operate. And so I thought, well, what's the point? So I didn't do it. All right, now we're getting into control. Again, we talk about a control operator and who the control operator is and who the responsibility falls on. In this case, when the control operator is not the station licensee, who is responsible for the proper operation of that station? The control operator and the station licensee are equally responsible. So if somebody comes over to my house and they want to operate, they can operate my 2-meter radio if they have a tech class license. Okay, I'm also responsible. I can walk out of the room, however, and if they're operating on 2 meters, that's fine, or any of the other authorized tech class frequencies, they can go ahead and operate all they want. I'm equally responsible though, but I don't have to actually be in the room. However, if that person wants to operate on HF in one of the voice bands, other than 10 meters, I, as the control operator, has to be I have to be in there. I have to be at the station with I don't actually have to push the mic button, but I have to be there physically for a tech class licensee to be able to legally operate in the HF bands outside of their class privileges. However, they also use my call sign. If they're operating with their own privileges within their own frequencies, they use their own call sign. Otherwise, they use my call sign in those portions where they aren't necessarily legal to do it. Let's see. Where are we? Okay. What determines the transmitting privileges of an amateur station? This is a no-brainer, really. The class of operator license held by the control operator. Again, your friend holds an extra class license, enters the station, wants to run your station on 29.6 megahertz FM. If you designate your friend as control operator of your station, his or her privileges are allowed uh, allow operations well above your normal tech class band limits. So in other words, if I come over to your house, you're a tech class, okay, and I'm an extra class, I'm allowed to go outside and over and above what your class of operator license is. I can operate 29.6 legally on your station. However, you cannot, but I have to use my call sign too. So which of the following is an example of automatic control? We've kind of beat this one to death, I think, but I thought it was kind of important to kind of cover again. But an automatic control example is a repeater. It's on I mean, you key up your mic to transmit on the input frequency, and the repeater hears you and it retransmits automatically on the output frequency of the repeater to the receive side, whoever's listening. So a repeater is an example of automatic control. So in which of the following circumstances may the control operator of an amateur station receive compensation for operating that station? This again is that really touchy area. Legally, you're not allowed to accept any compensation whatsoever. You go out and you work one of these events, say the MS Walk or something like that. No one is legally allowed to accept any monetary uh, compensation for their time and their service and the use of their equipment. There's only one exception, and that's when the communication is incidental to classroom instruction at an educational institution. And an instructor, a teacher, isn't really receiving monetary compensation for the operation of that ham radio there in the classroom. They're just getting paid for doing their job, period, basically. And it just so happens to be that part of their job is uh, teaching kids how to communicate over a radio, particularly with the International Space Station and types of science classes and things like that. Those are examples of when you would do something like that. So teachers, as an incidental use of amateur radio, are the only ones that really get paid, let's say, and it's really not a compensation for that. It's just for doing their job. All right. Again, we get into some more rules here, and I did a few of these as well. So which of the following circumstances are amateur stations authorized to transmit signals related to broadcasting, program production, or news gathering, assuming no other means is available? Okay. That's the key point here. Okay. Generally speaking, we're not allowed to broadcast anything. We're not allowed to be into any kind of, commercial program production or news gathering and sending it out to the general public and things of that sort. only where such communications directly relate to the immediate safety of human life or protection of property, and assuming that there is no other means available. In other words, ABC, NBC, CBS, and whatever else, those people aren't there, and you happen to come across a situation which, believe me, is extremely, extremely rare, in which there is an emergency situation. You might have a tsunami coming in, or whatever. You're on the coast and you recognize the signs of a tsunami, and there's nobody monitoring that, and you know that there's danger. And how you do that, I do not know. How you get it out to the public, I do not know. But um, if you assist in news gathering and disseminating that information in order to protect lives and property, that is acceptable. When is it permissible to transmit messages encoded to hide their meaning? All right, generally speaking, everything should be English, either voice or CW. However, there is an opportunity uh, to transmit messages that are encoded to hide their meaning. And the only time you're really allowed to do this is when you're transmitting control commands to space stations or radio control craft. So, and like it says here, secret codes and ciphers with the intent to scramble to prevent eavesdropping are normally not allowed except for control operators who transmit special telecommands to ham radio satellites or hams who enjoy flying their model aircraft. Okay. Those are signals which aren't voice, they aren't CW, and they're the only times that you can transmit uh, anything that you're not really hiding their meaning, you're just sending telecommands. I don't even know why they word it that way. It's such a stupid way to word things. But anyway, I didn't put together the questions. So, when must the station licensee make the station and its records available for FCC inspection? And of course, that is at any time upon request by an FCC representative. And we've talked about this before, that if you're talking particularly on HF, um, try to keep a logbook. And that way, if you get a complaint that you've caused some interference, you can go to your logbook. The FCC drops by and says, "Hey, we want to check your logbook. I want to check your equipment." You know, you can kind of cover yourself that way. And it rarely happens. But on occasion, particularly if there's a complaint filed, the FCC can come to your door. I know a few news stories where that has happened to a few people. So, what may result when correspondence from the FCC is returned undeliverable? Again, I kind of mentioned this. Oops, where am I? There we go. I keep hitting that wheel. You can get your station license suspended or revoked, basically. So, keep your addresses up to date. Any questions so far? I think everybody's pretty much got that down pretty good. Now we're going to get into some tech frequencies, and I guess sometimes these are a little bit more problematic, but some of the really these are just kind of basics for you. A radio wave is made up of what type of energy? And I think we beat this one to death pretty good. It's an electromagnetic property that makes up a radio wave. It's an electromagnetic field. It's made up by an electric field and a magnetic field, and they are perpendicular to one another. Um, and those kind of also determine how those two elements um, are transposed against one another. It's determines what the polarization is, whether it's horizontal or vertical polarization of the field that you're generating for the radio wave or the radio frequency, basically. And how fast does a radio wave travel through free space? That was part of, again, the that 300, that magic 300 number being 300 million meters per second, which is at the speed of light. And by using 300 and frequencies in megahertz, you can come up with the wavelength of a particular band, or frequency, I should say. So in free space, a radio wave travels at the speed of light. So what describes the number of times per second that an alternating current makes a complete cycle? Okay, this has to do with really the frequency that you're transmitting on. It alternates depending on what the frequency is, back and forth for a complete cycle. And remember, we call this these cycles per second is abbreviated hertz. And you see the abbreviation is capital H and little z. So don't forget the capital H. Remember that, because there are a few questions that kind of trick you there. So what is the proper abbreviation for megahertz? Look at this very carefully, because sometimes you might look at this and say, oh, yeah, okay, hertz has to be capitalized. You might think it's A. No. M also has to be capitalized in this case. So D is the correct answer. Capital M, capital H, little z. Same thing with kilohertz, capital K, capital H, little z. So what is the name for the distance a radio wave travels during one complete cycle? And again, we talk about not the wave speed or the wave form or the wave spread. We're talking about wave length. There is a particular length that a frequency, one cycle of a frequency travels. And let's see. If you remember that the longer the wavelength, the lower in frequency. Longer the wavelength, the lower in frequency. So 160 meter wavelength is a 1.8 megahertz frequency. However, when we jump from 160 meters to 10 meters, we automatically have a increase in frequency at 28 megahertz. So the shorter the wavelength, being 10 meters, the higher in frequency it goes. Shorter the wavelength, the higher in frequency it goes. So at 28 megahertz, that wavelength is going 28 million times per second, alternating 28 million times per second, versus at 160 meters, it's alternating 1,800,000 times per second. What property of radio waves is often used to identify the different frequency bands? Okay, again, the property of the radio waves that we just talked about is the approximate wavelength. How does the wavelength of a radio wave relate to its frequency? I just kind of mentioned that the wavelength gets longer as let's see, look at these very carefully, okay? The wavelength gets shorter as the frequency increases. So the higher in frequency we go, the shorter the distance between each wave. The lower we go, the longer distance between each wave. Lower, longer, higher, shorter. Lower, longer, higher, shorter. And there's our little formula for converting frequency to wavelength and vice versa. So 300 divided by frequency in megahertz will give you the wavelength. The wavelength in meters will give you, divided to 300 gives you the frequency in megahertz. Good to go. So what is the maximum peak envelope power output for tech class operators using their assigned portions of the HF bands? You don't have the maximum stated here, so this should be really a no-brainer for all of you. The maximum on HF bands a tech class operator can use is 200 watts. However, when you get above the HF bands into 6 meters and higher frequencies, you have the opportunity to transmit the full legal limit of 1.5 kilowatts or 1,500 watts of power. When you upgrade to general, you can operate in other portions of the HF bands, and you can also operate the legal limit of 1,500 watts or 1.5 kilowatts. But for tech class, 200 watts on HF. Okay, what are the frequency limits of the VHF spectrum? Now, there is a chart that I'm going to throw up here. You should have that also in the folder on Dropbox. Just a minute while I cough. Okay, predominantly your HF bands are again 3 to 30 megahertz. And when you get above that into VHF, you get 30 to 300 megahertz. And then 300 megahertz above that is UHF, and then you get into higher frequencies. What's going on here? Oops. I wish I could kind of put this on here. There we go. Stupid sunflower seeds. All right, you can see here what your spectrum is. And you can see that HF is 3 to 30. And then you get into VHF, and you have low band FM and the high band VHF, but it extends from 30 to 300. And then from 300 to 3 gigahertz is UHF. And then above that is like your super high frequencies. So there's your part of your spectrum. So what is a band plan beyond the privileges established by the FCC? Now, the FCC kind of says these are the frequencies you're allowed, that the amateur that are assigned to the amateur band, and you're allowed to operate on as a collective. Let's put it that way. However, in many cases, the bands themselves are divided up for particular purposes, but it's not an FCC dictate. So really, beyond the privileges established by the FCC, there's a voluntary guideline for using the different modes or activities within the amateur band. Some portions of these bands are, it's kind of a gentleman's agreement that, okay, you use this portion for transmitting slow scan TV, this portion for doing digital communications, and different portions for different activities and things. So they're voluntary guidelines, and they're established by a volunteer coordinator, which is selected by the ham radio community at large. Okay, why should you not set your transmit frequency to be exactly at the edge of an amateur band or subband? Very, very easy on this one. Sometimes your radio is not really totally and fully calibrated to an exact frequency, and there may be errors in your transmitter frequency display. Also, when you modulate the signal, then you might, and if you're too close, the side bands might extend outside that particular band edge. And again, you want to allow for transmitter frequency drift. So all of these choices are correct. So you really want to stay well away from the band edges in case your signal should, for some reason, drift or extend beyond the band edge. Okay, your first radio. Anybody have any questions before we continue on? We're just about halfway through this. With your first radio, what is the approximate bandwidth of a VHF repeater FM phone signal? And typically, your deviation in an FM phone signal will be between 10 and 15 kilohertz. So you really want to make sure. Most of them are less than that. Generally 10 is good, but for the purposes of this exam, between 10 and 15. If you remember, FM is about 10 kilohertz wide. You should be good to go with answering any of these questions. And of course, the type of modulation most commonly used for VHF packet radio transmissions is FM. It just sends a signal out on the FM, rides on the FM carrier, and all that information is in the packet that you're transmitting. All right, here we go. We're going to go solo. So you get your first radio and everything, and it's good to listen a lot, but to understand the difference between simplex and duplex communication. Simplex communications is being able to communicate directly with the other person on the same frequency. You're transmitting and receiving on one frequency, and your buddy is transmitting and receiving on that same frequency. There's only one frequency involved. It could be the national calling frequency for VHF on 2 meters, which is 146.52 megahertz. That is a pretty much a designated simplex frequency. If you're using duplex, you could be transmitting on one frequency and receiving on another frequency. Crossband operation is kind of like that, where you might transmit on VHF and receive on UHF, and your buddy is receiving your VHF signal and transmitting on UHF back to you. In a repeater situation, it's kind of like a duplex frequency. It's a split frequency, and typically for 2 meters, it's 600 kilohertz. For UHF, it's 5 megahertz is the split. So you have one frequency that you transmit on. That's the frequency the repeater receives, and it retransmits your signal on another frequency, 600 kilohertz, different from the receive frequencies, and and everybody's using that same configuration. Everybody's going to transmit on the same frequency and receive the frequency that the repeater is transmitting out on. That's a duplex frequency, basically. So which of the following is a guideline when choosing an operating frequency for calling CQ? Actually, all of these are correct. 80% of your hobby is going to be listening. At least I hope so. I do more listening than I do talking. So you want to listen first to be sure no one else is using the frequency. That may be you turn on the radio, you're home from work, you're sitting in the shack, you turn on the radio, and you don't immediately pick up the microphone. You listen for a few moments to see if anything's going on. And if you're on HF, you may only hear one side of the conversation. If you're in a particular area of the country, you may hear one person talking, but you're not hearing the other person they're talking to. And that happens sometimes, like on 20 meters, for instance. Sitting here on top of the mountain, I hear a station, say in Texas, for instance, and they finish talking, and the person they're talking to is somewhere here in Pennsylvania. They could be out in Hanover or, Harrisburg or someplace like that. I can't hear the person in Harrisburg because their signal is overshooting me, and the person in Texas does hear them. So really, you want to listen to see what's going on. And if you don't hear anything after a few moments, you can also ask, is this frequency in use? It could be that person in your part of the neck of the woods is talking, but you don't hear them, hopefully the guy in Texas will come back and say, yes, the frequency is in use. And you can just go ahead and find another frequency. And you also want to make sure you are in your assigned portion of your operating privileges. So be very aware of that. So what should you do if another operator reports that your station 2-meter signals were strong just a moment ago, but now they are weak and distorted? Again, this is one of those where the longest answer is correct. Okay, you could have been walking around and all of a sudden they lost your signal. So try moving a few feet or changing the direction of your antenna if possible, as reflections may be causing multipath distortion as well. Q signals are pretty interesting, and these are all valid Q signals, and they're just a short term, mostly used in CW, but you can get them in, use them in voice as well. There's no prohibition on that. But if you're receiving interference from another station, it means that you're getting QRM. QRM is the code for interference from another station. QRN is noise. QTH is home. QSB, I believe, is frequency or something like that. I don't use that one very often. I can't remember what QSB is. So which Q signal indicates that you are changing frequency? Very easy to remember this one, QSY. If you remember the Y, you come down and it means you're coming down that one little leg there. You're on this frequency and you're going to QSY over to that frequency. So that's how I initially learned it. What is a grid locator? We talked about this. I'm in FN00. It's a 2-letter and number geographic location that sometimes is used in contesting. If you're into contesting, somebody might say, what's your grid locator? Maybe that's part of the requirement of the contest rules, is to give your call sign and your grid locator number. And that's what that is, a geographical location in a grid square. Any questions? Good to go? All right. I have no doubt you guys are going to pass. I'm going to be there. I don't think, I was looking at my volunteer examiner badge from the ARRL, and it has my old call sign. I don't know if they actually fixed it, because I don't have another badge, and this one was only good through March 31st of 2018. And I'm trying to find out if I'm legal to be a VE for Saturday's session. And so far, the ARRL has not gotten back to me. If this was the Laurel Club, yeah, I'd be valid because I'm valid there. Repeaters, again, what types of amateur stations can automatically retransmit the signals of other amateur stations? I would like to say that remember a particular word, but it seems like all these have some form or another. The only correct answer is B. Any repeater, auxiliary, or space station can automatically retransmit your signal. What is the most common use of the reverse split function of a VHF UHF transceiver? Remember, when you're operating a repeater, you're using two different frequencies. You're transmitting on one frequency, you're receiving on another frequency. You're receiving the frequency that the repeater transmits on. And so that is a split. On VHF or 2 meters, the split is 600 kilohertz apart. So in other words, the 146.82 repeater, it transmits on 146.82 out. It receives on 146.22 input, which is 600 kilohertz lower than the output. But the common use of the reverse split function is so that you can reverse. Most transceivers have the ability to pretty much push a button so that you can listen in on the input of the repeater frequency. And I do that quite often here. If somebody isn't in on, like, on the nets, for instance, in the mornings, they might be a little weak into the repeater, but I might be able to hear them on the input. So I'll just push the button, and while everybody else is hearing noise or sporadic communications on the repeater's output frequency, I'm hearing what the repeater should be hearing uh, on the frequency that the person is transmitting in. That's a reverse split. So you monitor the repeater input frequency. And sometimes that's also used if you're kind of talking, you kind of meet on the repeater or something, and you can hear each other on the input. You just say, hey, let's go to a simplex frequency and not tie up the repeater. You just move off to 146.52 or any one of the other simplex frequencies and chit chat all you want there. So that's a good purpose for your reverse split function of a VHF UHF transceiver. So the common repeater frequency offset in the 2-meter band is plus or minus 600 kilohertz. I mentioned that. In the 146 portion, it's a minus offset for the input. In the 147 megahertz portion of the 2-meter band, it's a 600 plus offset to the higher end. And that just remember that also in UHF, for the 70 centimeter band, it's plus or minus 5 megahertz. Which of the following could be the reason you are unable to access a repeater whose output you can hear? You can hear the repeater, but for some reason, you can't access the repeater. So again, you do a little troubleshooting and you try to figure out what in the world is going on. Why can't I access this repeater? So you check to make sure that you have the right transceiver offset, that you're trying to access the 146.82 repeater, but for some reason your radio is transmitting on 146.6 on the frequency, the input frequency of the 6.1 or some other frequency. So an improper transceiver offset could be a problem. The repeater may require a CTCSS tone or a continuous tone-coded squelch system tone, otherwise known as a PL tone or a private line tone. The repeater may also require a proper digital coded squelch tone from your transceiver. Some repeaters use CTCSS and some repeaters use DCS, but all these choices are correct. A tone burst is something that is more prevalent in the European nations. They don't use necessarily the CTCS. They use something completely different. It's just a tone that just momentarily bursts out as you key the microphone, and it activates the receiver in the repeater, and they talk there. So that's a little different. So what brief statement indicates that you are listening on a repeater and looking for a contact? In this case, it's the shortest answer, by the way. Get on the repeater and say, this is N3LMS mobile. Or you can say, this is N3LMS. Anybody out there listening today? You know, it's almost like calling CQ. You don't want to call CQ on an FM repeater. If you're using 2-meter sideband or CW, yeah, you can use CW or a CQ for that. It's very, very poor form to get on to a repeater and go, CQ, this is N3LMS mobile driving down Highway 47. Anybody around on 2 meters today? That is definitely a no-no. So basically just give your call sign. So which of the following entities recommends transmit receive channels and other parameters for auxiliary and repeater stations? Well, if you answered B, you are correct. There's a volunteer frequency coordinated recognized by local amateurs. They're selected by your local amateur organizations, and they coordinate frequencies to minimize or reduce interference between repeaters. Just a minute, another cough coming through. I got a really dry throat tonight. So, B is the correct answer. Regional frequency coordinators. So, who selects a frequency coordinator? Well, amateur operators in a local or regional area whose stations are eligible to be repeater or auxiliary stations. They're voted in by positions to their positions by fellow hams who are active repeater station owners. Ooh, I just do. All right, any questions? Everybody good to go? Good deal. Okay, when do the FCC rules not apply to the operation of an amateur station? Holy smokes! When do they never? When do they not apply to an operation of an amateur station? I'm going to tell you this: that word "not" being capitalized should remind you of the other N word, never. So you're bound by the FCC rules, even if you get a request from the FBI, FEMA, or other federal agency, and it does not relieve you from obeying the FCC rules in a time of an emergency, even. All right, the Amateur Radio Emergency Service. Now, the question before this was about the RACES station. To identify what a RACES station is, the key thing about a RACES station is it's primarily an organization for civil defense. It's usually activated. The RACES group is activated in times of civil defense and other emergencies. So just kind of remember that. But the Amateur Radio Emergency Service, or ARES, is very similar to RACES, and it actually is a group of licensed amateurs who have voluntarily registered their qualifications and equipment for communications duty in public service. So, public service. If you look there, the only time that public service, the words public service, is used in any of these answers is in A. So if you remember civil defense for RACES, remember public service for ARES, or ARES. So what do they have in common? Both of them have in common is that they may provide communications during emergencies. And sometimes they work together. What information is contained in the preamble of a formal traffic message? This has to do with handling health and welfare messages or just routine messages and things of that sort. Remember the radiograms I showed you? These there is a national traffic system, and these messages are passed back and forth. And even under practice, they're typically routine messages anyway for practicing. But the preamble has to contain certain information in it. And that is to make sure that the message is delivered completely and accurately. So you want to make sure that the information needed to track the message is all in there. That includes what the handling instruction is, what the priority is of it, whether it's routine, health and welfare, or whatever. And there's a check. The check says, okay, there's this number of words in it, and by the time you write everything down in the message part of the of it, if the check is 25 and you only get 24 words, you want to double check to make sure that the check is correct or that the message is correct. That and those are all the information you need to track the message needs to be in the preamble. So what should be done when using voice modes to ensure that voice messages containing unusual words are received correctly. You want to make sure that you spell words using a standard phonetic alphabet and always use the ITU standard phonetics. They are recognized worldwide. Okay, weak signal propagation. Anything? Any questions anybody have? We're almost done here, I think. Well, 64 out of 100. Okay, weak signal propagation has to do with using VHF and UHF radio signals, not using necessarily FM. But why do VHF and UHF radio signals usually travel somewhat farther than the visual line of sight distance between two stations? Now, there is a slight curve to the Earth, of course. It's not flat. And VHF and UHF frequencies really don't see that curve the same way we do visually. So you can add another 15% to the visual range because they will actually extend over the horizon a little bit. Answer is C. How might fog and light and rain affect, or fog and light rain affect radio range on the 10 meter and 6 meter bands? Keep in mind, we're talking 10 meters and 6 meters, and in actuality, that will have very little, if any, effect on most radio signals below UHF. When you get up into UHF, rain, precipitation, and fog and stuff can actually degrade the signals, particularly in microwave frequencies. But for 10 and 6 meters, a little bit of rain won't hurt anything. Which of the following effects might cause radio signals to be heard despite obstructions between transmitting and receiving stations? We talked about this before. I kind of gave you some examples. There is a thing called knife edge diffraction. And what happens there is they propagate, there's a vertical polarization, and your signal will propagate when the lower edge of the vertical wave strikes a distant, elevated, sharp object like the peak between you and your friend. The lower portion of the wave tends to drag over the hill, causing a knife edge diffraction. And that's what I used with my beam to communicate with the VHF 2 meter repeater in Winchester, Virginia, all the way from Sterling. I had a mountain between me and them, and I used a little bit of reflection or knife edge diffraction to access the repeater. Answer is A. So what causes tropospheric ducting? Typically speaking, you have conditions that the atmosphere will heat up, and all of a sudden you create a situation where a temperature inversion will cause a tunnel effect, and all of a sudden your 2 meter or even 70 centimeter bands will enter that duct and travel for long distances, and they can last anywhere from maybe a few seconds to several minutes. And so there you go. Temperature inversions is what really causes tropospheric ducting to affect 2 meter and 70 centimeter bands. There is a website that is available. I don't know what it is offhand, that kind of tracks what is going on in the atmosphere at any particular time. And I've seen where temperature inversions have created the capability for 2 meter signals to travel, say from Virginia up into Indiana through the tropospheric ducting. So what band is best suited for communicating via meteor scatter? Wow. You have a meteor shower, and I tell you, there's one little band that everybody calls the magic band, because I tell you, conditions will open up on this band um, at a moment's notice and can be affected by so many things. That it's very interesting sometimes, and I wish I could get in on some of this stuff. The 6 meter band I have the capability these days, and I don't always am able or at a convenient time to get involved in things when the 6 meter band opens up, but it's a 6 meter band. So when you have meteor showers, if you have one coming on and you have a 6 meter radio, turn on your 6 meter radio and see what happens. You can really get some really good communications out there. On which HF band does a tech class operator have phone privileges? There's only one HF band that your tech license will allow you to operate voice or phone privileges on, and that's 10 meters, and it's only from 28.3 to 28.5. However, you do have access from 28 megahertz up to 28.5 megahertz. The only thing is that from 28 to 28.3 is CW. So your phone privileges are 200 kilohertz wide. So which of the following HF bands have frequencies available to the tech class operator for RTTY and data transmissions? Again, you got to remember that on the other three HF bands that you have privileges that you would have privileges on as a tech class licensee is 80 meters, 40 meters, and 15 meters. And those are only in the CW portion. You're only allowed to operate CW, and it's a very small portion. If you look at your chart, you can see what those are. But the 10-meter band only is the only band you're allowed to operate some digital communications. And you're limited to 200 watts. Which of the following bands may provide long-distance communications during the peak of a sunspot cycle? Holy smokes, we're kind of like on the leading edge of another sunspot cycle. It's kind of slow to start. And it doesn't promise to be very robust this time around. It's cycle 25. But generally speaking, during the peak of these cycles that last for anywhere from 10, 11, 12 years, for the cycle to totally complete. At the peak of it, in the middle of that, for maybe 2 or 3 years, you have some really, really good communications. You can talk around the world using 6 and 10 meter bands during the peak of the solar cycle. And it's known as sporadic E. Occasionally, even at low points, sporadic E will crop up, and you can get an occasional momentary long distance communication and DX communication out of your 6 and 10 meter bands, particularly the 10 meter band, if a sporadic E condition happens to flare up at any time during a low solar cycle point. So, what property of a radio wave is used to describe its polarization? Now, we kind of talked about this before, and remember, the polarization is tied to the electrofield. It's an electromagnetic energy that makes up your radio wave, and they're perpendicular to one another. The electric is one way and the magnetic field is another, but the polarization of your radio signal is defined by its electric field. So it's easy to remember this because the E field is the same orientation as the antenna element that it creates. So your element is the electrical field. So if you have a vertical element, your electric field polarization is vertical for that radio signal. Okay, outer space. Anything else you want to talk about before we continue on? Good to go? All right, here we go. So FCC Part 97 gives you a definition of what a space station is. And particularly, if you remember that there's a number associated with that. Oops, come on. It's easy to remember that any amateur station located more than 50 kilometers above the Earth's surface is considered a space station. Answer is C. And again, a space station can be, a satellite or something, and capable of automatic operation and repeating, automatically resending signals that it receives. So which of the following are provided by satellite tracking programs? Uh, Satellite tracking programs are uh, almost necessary if you're going to be operating satellite communications. There's lots of satellites out there that are available that they go. Some of them go north to south, others go east to west. Some are in some kind of an odd diagonal elliptical orbit. Things of that sort. You got to remember that there's a Doppler shift of how it operates. But the thing is that all of these are really correct. The maps showing the real time position of the satellite track over the Earth, the time, the azimuth, the elevation of the start, maximum altitude, the end of the pass, the frequency of the satellite transmission, including effects of Doppler shift. So these are called Keplerian data sets or KEPS, and they're updated pretty much continually. And they tell you everything that you need to know about a satellite. And what causes spin fading of satellite signals? Remember that satellite is out there, and it's not really staying in one position basically as it travels around the Earth. It actually rotates. The rotation of the satellite and its antennas and may cause spin fading. Um, but it needs to do that in order to keep the elements, the solar panels from heating up too much, which power the station. Also, you want to make sure that you limit your power when talking to a satellite. So you don't want to overpower the station. Um, Remember that there is a way to communicate with a satellite. There's an uplink and a downlink frequency. And here we're going to talk about it. What is meant by the statement that a satellite is operating in UV mode? U being, of course, it's the uplink and downlink frequencies that it's talking about here. So your uplink, the first one is your uplink, and it happens to be UHF or the 70 centimeter band, and the downlink is VHF or the 2-meter band. So you'd be operating your radio in a split mode. You're going to be transmitting on UHF and receiving on VHF. Questions? Good. All right. Now we got a computer. So your computer is pretty handy sometimes in ham radio. You can do a lot of things with it. You can hook it up digitally with a little USB box, like I showed you before, a little signal link. But you can also do really simple stuff. Um, how is the computer's sound card used when conducting digital communications? You want to make sure that this happens to be the longest answer, by the way. A sound card provides audio to the radio's microphone input and converts received audio to digital form. So you really need a sound card with appropriate software to do the decoding of the digital messages. Now, if you don't have something to go between the radio, like I said before, when I won't be able to transmit without my little signal link. But if you just want to listen and you want to decode what is there being sent, you can simply take the speaker output of your radio and put it to the mic input or line input of your computer. And make sure that the volume isn't too loud. You don't want to blow the mic input or the line input of your computer. So you want to make sure your volume is turned down, and then turn it up just enough. You want to start your program, your digital program, and then turn it up just enough to start getting some proper decoding of the signals that you're going to see on the screen of the digital communications. You won't be able to transmit, but at least you can kind of listen in and see what's being sent. So which of the following connections might be used between a voice transceiver and a computer for digital operation? No brainer here. All of these choices are correct. So the oldest official digital mode is RTTY or CW with a small adjustment of the definition. So too are IEEE 802.11 and JT65. All of these are digital modes. What name is given to an amateur radio station that is used to connect other amateur stations to the internet? And we talked about this internet radio linking project and things, the wide area network and all that, where we have a lot of radios, repeaters tied together to cover a much broader and wider area. But generally speaking, the station that's used to connect other stations to the internet is called a gateway. Multi-mode radio excitement. We got 17 slides left. So a multi-mode transceiver. What is it, by the way? Let's see. It's a transceiver that can send and receive different modes of radio signals. The term mode refers to the type of modulation emission used to send the signals. And you can look at the illustration below. We can send Morse code signals, otherwise known as CW or continuous wave. You tap out a message. You can modulate an AM signal on an RF carrier wave. You can broadcast single sideband, which is a form of amplitude modulation, except you're not really transmitting a carrier. You're only transmitting one side of the bands, the two sidebands that normally make up an AM signal. If you transmit a lower sideband or an upper sideband, you also, another mode is FM or frequency modulation. So these are all different types of ways and modes that a transceiver has as far as being considered to be a multi-mode transceiver. You have various ways to communicate. So which of the following is a form of amplitude modulation? Again, we just kind of covered that. Single sideband is a form of amplitude modulation. It's also very efficient. Typically speaking, a sideband signal is only 3 kilohertz wide, whereas an AM, an amplitude modulation or a full AM signal would be 6 kilohertz wide typically. So in order to save bandwidth, you remove one sideband and the carrier and transmit on a single sideband. And it's a form of amplitude modulation. I just kind of covered this. The bandwidth of a sideband signal is typically around 3 kilohertz. Again, your VHF is between 10 and 15. So which of the following is an appropriate receive filter bandwidth for minimizing noise and interference for single sideband? Now, if your sideband is 3 kilohertz wide, you want something that's about 2.4 kilohertz or 2400 hertz. It's a good filter to have for sideband to help. That filter will help reject adjacent channel or adjacent frequency interference by narrowing down the receiver so that you're only receiving the person you want to receive. And a CW, of course, is a real narrow one, and the maximum bandwidth of a CW signal is typically about 150 hertz. It's just like an on and off tone, basically. So it is real narrow, and you can get a lot of communications in a small amount of space on the bands with CW. It is one of the most efficient ways to communicate. And CW usually will get through when single sideband or other phone methods have difficulty getting through. And that's why that's one reason why it might be important to want to learn Morse code. But 150 hertz. Also, a 300 hertz filter or 500 hertz filter might be suitable for CW. So, which of the following is used to convert a radio signal from one frequency to another? This is a little bit different than a transverter, but it's a mixer. It's a nonlinear device. It takes two radio signals, creates both the sum and the difference frequencies of two input frequencies. Um, in the older crystal controlled radios, like my old CB, my 525 Lafayette, I went in and added added a couple switches and added some different crystals and everything, and I could switch in all those frequencies that you're not supposed to have on CB. As a matter of fact, I put in some when they went to 40 channels. My radio was 23, so I did a little mixing with different crystals to get those frequencies up above channel 23. So, what device converts RF input and output of a transceiver to another band? Uh, Not really unlike the mixer. You're wanting to transmit on another band. Typically, some of your HF uh, stations or HF radio equipment, they would market also what was called a transferter for 2 meters and 6 meters. So it would transvert or convert signals from, say, typically if you uh, I'm trying to remember here. I think for 6 meters, trying to remember going backwards here. I think you could operate on 15 meters through the transverter to get 6 meters. I think that's how that worked. Interference. We kind of talked about this as well. Any other questions? Anything? We're good to go. Good to go. All right. Talk a little bit about interference. What can you do if you're told your FM handheld or mobile transceiver is over deviating? Um, when you over deviate, what you're doing is you're overdriving the modulation circuit that injects your audio into the carrier of your FM transmitter. Um, and usually that's because you're really maybe talking too close to it. This is another reason why I really frown personally on having power mics on an FM or a 2 meter radio because they don't always work properly and they can over deviate and you can cause splatter. So you want to talk a little bit further away from the microphone. Ideally, you want to talk across the microphone and you want to hold the microphone probably about at least 3 to 5 inches away from your mouth if possible. But that will eliminate over deviating the signal. So, what is the source of a high pitched whine that varies with engine speed in a mobile transceiver's receive audio? You hear this ignition noise, but it's not necessarily the ignition. It's part of the ignition, but actually it's the alternator. There's an alternator whine. You hear that alternator going, you step on the gas and it goes, and can cause some issues. So you're going to need some DC filter chokes. It's always best that your your radio is powered directly from the battery and that both leads have not only fuses on them, but also that you have a filter or a choke or something on your power line leads to minimize or even eliminate that alternator whine that you get from your alternator. So, what would cause a broadcast AM or FM radio to receive an amateur radio transmission unintentionally? Okay. Um, Very simple. Again, this is the longest answer. The receiver itself is unable to reject strong signals outside the AM or FM. So, your neighbor is sitting there and they've got the AM or FM radio going. They're listening to their nice music, might be listening to, I don't know, the Glenn Miller Band or something like that. You're in your ham radio shack and you're talking and blah, 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 blah. And all of a sudden, you're interfering with them and uh, it, it's not necessarily your fault, but it's really the fault of the receiver being unable to reject strong signals outside the AM or FM band. A lot of times, these little cheaper AM FM radio receivers, for commercial use have a very poor design. They're very broad banded. They don't have a lot of good filtering on them. But, that's something you have to kind of be mindful of. Okay, electrons. We've only got 5 more, and we're just going to talk a little bit about electrons and going with the flow so that everybody understands a little bit of the relationship. Remember that little circle, okay? The E over IR and the P over IE. If you know and understand those and plug them into your mind, you shouldn't have any difficulty with understanding those relationships. But basically, your electromotive force, represented by the E, is called the volt. So, the electromotive force, may the force be with you. A is your answer. Of course, the name for the flow of electrons of the electric circuit is current, and it's measured in amps. Current is measured in amps. And here's a way that we set up our how to test. If you want to see what the current is, make sure that your meter is set properly. You have the leads plugged in properly, and what they've done here is it pulled out. They want to see if current is flowing in here. So he's got his probe connected to the back of the light bulb here, and it flows through the meter to show the amperes, flows back out through the battery, and then the other side of the battery goes in, and of course the on-off switch should be on. And it gives an indication of how much current or how many amperes are flowing through the circuit. If you want to check voltage and you want to, and that's in parallel, by the way. I mean, this is in series. You're connecting in series. My apologies for that. Here's a series circuit, but you want to test the voltage here. You're going to leave the circuit intact, and you're going to put your voltmeter across the 6-volt lamp. A 6-volt lamp might be burnt out. It might be a new lamp. You don't know what's going on. You want to make sure that you have voltage. Now, you can either check the battery to see if it has anything, but you want to see that there's voltage there. So that's how you would hook up your meter for checking voltage. There is a voltage drop across that resistor, but again, across all components, the voltage should be the same. Current will split, voltage does not. What electronic component allows current to flow in only one direction? Okay, now remember, a resistor actually opposes current flow. A fuse will blow if there's too much current, and driven element, I don't know what that has to do with it, but it's a diode. Diode is like a check valve. It's also called a rectifier. The diode allows current to flow in only one direction. You have an anode and a cathode. Remember, there's that little line with a little arrow. That's your symbol for your diode. But a diode is what allows current to flow in only one direction. All right, what instrument is used to measure resistance? Okay, remember, resistance is in ohms. Voltage is in volts, or electromotive force is in volts. So you use a voltmeter to measure volts, or a multimeter set to voltage. And depending on whether it's AC or DC, depends on where you put your setting for the volt portion of your meter. And an amp meter measures current. It has to be connected correctly. But an ohm meter is what is used to check the ohms or the resistance of a resistor in a DC circuit. I want to make sure that power is turned off before you even do that. It kind of brings us to the end. I didn't bring in any more slides, but if there's anything else somebody wants to discuss, I figured that what we talked about before here recently was fresh enough in your minds. We didn't need to review it, but if there's something you really want to review, we'll certainly do that. So, but I have nothing more at this time. Anything anybody have? Good to go. All right. Great. Great. Mitch, I can't see you, so I can't hear you at all. Here, I'll unmute your mic. Mitch, anything?
Nope, I'm good.
Yeah, this is all new stuff to you, I think.
Yeah.
You've done it before, I think. But
Yep.
all right. Over to you, Cohen. Anything?
Just about the registration for Saturday.
Okay.
I know, like, we need our social security number, license, I suppose. I guess it's only 2 forms of identification we need.
You'll need 2 forms of ID. Your driver's license and usually a credit card is another form that can be used for ID, or maybe a passport or something. As long as you have 2 forms of ID, even a concealed carry permit, and that's all that's required for identification.
It's $15 to take the test, correct?
Yes. Yes.
Okay. Do we need to have cash, check? How's that work?
Yeah, I'll take check.
Okay. Just have to make sure I grab one.
Yeah, since Eric and those guys, the club is more affiliated with the ARRL. There's a cost associated with the materials and the processing that they do, and it doesn't go to anyone but for that purpose. There are some, like the Laurel Group. They just kind of absorb the cost, and they don't charge anybody to take the test. So if that's a concern, if you want to wait until the following Friday on the 15th and go down to Johnstown, take the test there, you certainly can. But if you want to do it sooner, on Saturday, everybody has the address for that place, right?
It's actually just down the street from where I work.
Yeah, it's 615 4th Street. I know, Dave, you're going over to the Cambria Club, but there's a parking lot when you're driving down 6th Avenue there. If you know where Frederick Lock and Key is, just past there, not too far past there, and past the 8th Street bridge, where you'd turn off to go across the 8th Street bridge, go past that, and you see the church. And just right there, when you see that church, there's a parking lot on the left-hand side. And you just kind of turn in there and park, and you walk to the gate, and there's a little button that you push on the little box, and you say you're there for the test, and you get let in that way.
Okay, well, Kevin, I must have misunderstood Kevin, because it's not 10 blocks down the street from where I work.
Okay.
So
I'm going to plan to be there.
Yeah, I'm just going to go ahead and put that right into my phone, so I'll have it. And I'll just.
Okay. All right.
What was the 615 4th Street?
615 4th Street. Yes. I think, let me see if I can, I think there's a map here. Blah, 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 blah. Let's see if I can find it. Ah, there it is. Let me bring this over. Okay. And let me share the screen again. Okay. All right. If you see that, I'm not sure. Let me see if I can kind of zoom in a little bit. There we go. But at any rate, there is, if you're going down, there's 5th Street right there, and there's 4th Street. There's 7th Avenue. Here's 6th Avenue, or 764. So when you're coming down the road, there's this church right here. This is the 911 center the place where they're going to do it. This is a little bit different. They have fencing around there now, but this is the parking lot that's used. So you park in this parking lot between 5th and 4th Street, between 6th Avenue and 7th Avenue, and just walk down here. There's a gate here, and we go in that door right there.
Okay. Yeah, it's actually very close to where I work, but still.
Okay.
I'll make sure I have the address though in the thing. So
Good deal.
good.
All right. Thanks, Colin. All right. Next, let's see. Dave, are you good to go? Hello, Dave. Are you awake? Dave is asleep. Dave. All right. Dave fell asleep, it looks like. Let's see. John and
crew. This is on YouTube.
Hi, Wayne. Kevin told us that we should get our FRN number ahead of time. And that,
Well, do you have an
FRN?
well, I didn't till this evening. I did that this afternoon. I got it. It didn't take long.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
The website's on the bottom of page 204 in the book.
Okay.
And it just took me a minute, and then I have my FRN number. So
It
I'll take these
helps.
guys.
Yeah. It helps to
helps to
speed
speed
things up.
things
Let's
up.
put it that way. So rather than getting one assigned, you go and get one. That's good.
Good.
Okay.
Okay.
He wanted me to say that. Other than that, I think we're doing pretty good.
All right.
All right.
Well, I'll see
I'll
everybody,
see everybody
Saturday. I'm going to have
I'm gonna have this
put up there
put up
too.
there.
I sent out the link to Tuesday's session. I also uploaded today all the Dropbox into the Dropbox, all the stuff that I kind of shared as far as stuff I had available in my little folder here. Should help you a little bit, and everybody should have access to it. Tomorrow morning, I'm going to go ahead and upload this video to YouTube. Make sure that it's good to go, and I'll send a link out to everybody tomorrow morning so that if you want to go through it again tomorrow evening. Best, however, if you just kind of look through your book, if you're not sure about something, do the ARRL online test, ham test online, or whatever resource you've been using. And it sounds like you're doing pretty good, all of you. So other than that, I'll see everybody Saturday. You got more, Colin?
Yeah, just one quick question about the FRN.
Yep.
I did not get that, and I did not send it in with when I sent him that email.
Uh-huh.
But I guess my social security number will work just as well, then, right?
Yeah, I mean, you'll get one assigned to you, so it's not imperative. It's good to have because it'll speed things up, but we'll take care of all that stuff at the test session.
Okay.
Okay. I'm going to stop the broadcast here and